Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me today here on Point of View. It is the Wednesday edition, and I always appreciate you joining me for as long as you possibly can. Over the next couple of hours, though, we're going to cover a lot of different topics. First of all, we'll talk about the vaccines for the coronavirus. We know a little bit more about that. As a matter of fact, Pfizer has gone from saying we have a vaccine which is 90% effective to one that's 95% effective. Maybe they decided to mention that since Moderna says theirs is 95% effective. We'll talk about the difference between the two vaccines and what that might mean in just a minute. One of the first articles I've posted, I'm going to wait till next hour to talk about that, so I have both you and all of our national audience. It's called Here is the Evidence. A lot of people have said the Trump campaign has been saying, without evidence, that voter fraud took place, and there's no evidence of that. Oh, yes? Oh, now we've got the longest list you can possibly imagine. You have to scroll and scroll and scroll and scroll and scroll just to see all of the material that is posted there. Then, if you click on any one of those, it takes you to the actual story. Now, it's kind of a hodgepodge in the sense that it has everything. So everything from affidavits that have been signed to already various court pleadings to articles that appeared in newspapers and various comments in social media, not all of which are even just completely related to this last few weeks, but some talking about some of the various systems of computers and a variety of others. So it's a resource that's available. And it was really basically what you would put together as an aggregator. And then those who are filing the lawsuits are going through pulling out the material that is going to stand the test in court. So anyway, that is our first article. Second one I'll get to a little bit later. Joe Biden hiring an anti-free speech zealot, or zealots actually is the title there, because this comes, interestingly enough, from Jonathan Turley. Now, if you have heard that name before, this is an individual that's a Democrat, who's a liberal, who is a professor at George Washington Law School, but nevertheless, on a number of occasions, because he's a very honest individual, points out things that of concern and sometimes disagrees with his fellow leftists that make statements that are just factually untrue. And he is more than just a little bit concerned about some of the individuals, one in particular, which we'll focus on, who is so much against the idea of free speech. Don't forget, of course, that the chief of staff that has been designated by Joe Biden would be an individual who's been a lobbyist for social media. So even though I'm going to spend some time this hour talking about the conversations and the testimony by people like Jack Dorsey and Mark Zuckerberg in front of the Senate Judiciary Committee, I think the chances are slim and none, as I said yesterday in my Viewpoints commentary, that any kind of reining in social media is going to take place. But we'll get to that as time goes on. This hour, if I have some time, I do want to play this very good play. Actually, I'll just read it from Dennis Prager on what schools should teach about race and slavery. And I was just reading today that some very prominent individuals in particular have decided to pull their kids out of the schools in New York City because what's being taught in some of these public schools is almost the most radical version of race theory. So we'll get into some of that as well. And so that gives you a little bit of an idea of what we'll be doing this hour. Then next hour, we will get into some of these national stories, especially since we will be joined then by people in Georgia, because Georgia is kind of ground central right now for the whole debate about recounts. And they just discover some ballots that never got counted. And, of course, you have 2 Senate races taking place. So Georgia's going to be on our mind. Georgia on our mind is going to be there for some time. And then we'll be talking with Danny Yohannan about fighting global poverty. The next hour, we'll be talking with Doug Paul about kingdom innovation for a brave new world. And then we'll get back to some of the issues in the news that we hadn't covered by that time. And that will finish off Wednesday. Tomorrow, we've got quite a number of guests all coming on seemingly almost simultaneously, from Richard Land to O.S. Hawkins, a variety of others. So we'll get to those later. And, of course, Friday weekend edition. Can't wait to hear from Penna Dexter and Kelly Shackelford what they might have to say about some of the things that have been taking place. But before we take a break, let's take the issue of the vaccine. Pfizer now says that with the interim results coming down, they now feel confident to say that their vaccine now is 95% effective. And most importantly, the vaccine protects older people most at risk of dying from COVID-19. The announcement just a week after they first revealed some of the preliminary results comes as they're preparing within days now to ask U.S. regulators to allow the emergency use of the vaccine. Well, Pfizer initially had estimated its vaccine with its partner was more than 90% effective after 94 infections had been counted. With Wednesday's announcement, the company now has accumulated 170 infections in the study and said only 8 of them occurred in volunteers who actually got the actual vaccine rather than a dummy shot. One of the 8 developed severe disease, the company said. This is, of course, all the struggle that you have to ask morally. If you think you have a vaccine that works, you almost want to give it to everybody. But if you have to actually prove to the FDA and others that it isn't anything more than a placebo effect, you have to give some people a dummy vaccine or whatever you want to call it, a placebo or something of that nature. And so this is kind of the struggle that they've had, because if we think this is working, and it seems to be, then why wouldn't we want to give it to everybody? But if you do, then, of course, you get into the issue of regulatory issues. Anyway, they say they're about 95% effective. Earlier this week, Moderna, which is out of Boston, actually announced that theirs seemed to be 94.5% effective. And so we have 2 looking like very effective vaccines, actually doing 2 different kinds of things, but the goal in each one is to get your antibodies to produce something that will then give you a chance of fighting the coronavirus. And so, if nothing else, that is the case. Pfizer expects to produce 50 million vaccine doses globally by 2020. And maybe up to 1.3 billion doses in 2021. So, if nothing else, the U.S. officials hope that right now they'll have about 20 million vaccine doses each from Moderna and Pfizer, which would be 40 million total, and that would be the first pass. Now, I had some questions off air. Well, who gets them? The argument has always been people, first of all, that are first responders. Second of all, the most vulnerable. And that makes some sense. It doesn't make sense to you. Well, again, there are probably other ways you could get access to this as well. I hate to say it because I fear that there are going to be a number of people that, even though the vaccine is out, won't take it. And, of course, we've already mentioned yesterday how the governor of New York said, I just don't trust any of this that's being done by Donald Trump. So Donald Trump the other day said, okay, we won't send them to New York City. We won't send them to New York State until they say they're ready for it. And then, of course, then they say, he's doing this because he doesn't like us. No, he's just doing it because he's not going to send vaccines to a state where you're not going to give them. Because, as we've mentioned before, especially the Pfizer vaccine, it's got to stay on dry ice. It really requires a fairly significant amount of containment and protection. And why send it to a state if nobody's going to use it? We'll take a break. We'll be back with more right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
You don't hear too many political commentators talking about the culture war these days, but I suspect that term might surface now that the election is behind us. Secular progressive politicians felt that they needed to hide some of their extreme views, but they're going to be more likely to promote them now that the election has passed. At the same time, many of the more moderate Democrats have voiced their concern that the party lost elections to the House of Representatives because of their controversial messages. Former Missouri Senator Claire McCaskill felt Democrats spent too much time talking about guns, abortion, gay rights, transsexuals, and socialism. David Hersani cites some of those criticisms voiced by Democrats and then wonders why some of the candidates complained that they were unfairly labeled socialist. He suggests if that's not the message you want to send, perhaps Nancy Pelosi shouldn't pose with a gaggle of Marxists on the cover of Rolling Stone. He reminds us that McCaskill had to apologize for using the word transsexual. He observes that most Americans have zero clue what McCaskill is sorry about. They may believe that letting genetic boys compete with their daughters in track and field is ridiculous. He also notes that the constant obsession with race isn't working. Democrats lost ground with black and Latino voters. If the goal is racial reconciliation, progressive use of identity politics, intersectionality, and critical race theory doesn't seem to be the answer, even for minority voters. I believe the culture war may be more intense than we've ever seen. The lesson some of the elected leaders should take away from this election is that hardcore progressive ideas don't resonate with most Americans. But that's not what many are saying. Instead, they feel less inclined to hide their agenda and plan to fight like never before. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Anti-Semitism, go to viewpoints.info/anti-Semitism. Viewpoints.info/anti-Semitism.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Let's talk a little bit about social media censorship. That is something I addressed yesterday in a Viewpoints commentary, talking about the previous time in which you had Jack Dorsey appear before the Senate. Yesterday, again, that took place, and probably another Viewpoints commentary coming out in the future, maybe not. But this time it was a little different because you had the CEO of Twitter, who is Jack Dorsey, who with his long beard and everything, as I said in my commentary yesterday, looked like he'd been out on the streets in San Francisco. And then Facebook CEO Mark Zuckerberg. And John Hinderaker actually said, I don't know what to make of Dorsey. He looks like a homeless person based on videos I've seen of his testimonies before congressional committees. He appears to be of below average intelligence. But that can hardly be true, he says. So maybe he's just playing dumb, trying to wait out the next few months and hope that the Democrats capture the presidency and the Senate and no one will ask him difficult questions ever again. By the way, this is assuming that that all takes place. And for the moment, let's just assume that's the case. But anyway, he said today, Ted Cruz, who made things hot for the Dorsey, actually raised some very important questions. And it was interesting because, as I'll read from some other people in just a minute, it is a good example of the fact that Jack Dorsey says, I really don't know if there is any of this kind of bias, and I don't really know if they do any kind of censorship. And he points out, that is John Hinderaker who wrote this, he said, my organization, which is kind of a Minnesota kind of pro-freedom group, I guess you could say, routinely runs ads and boosts posts on Facebook, either to drive political activism or to drive traffic to our website. And he said, Facebook has always been happy to take our money, but since November 3rd, Facebook has deemed the ads to be political and refused to run them. Some of the people have been complaining that before the election, censorship was taking place. John Hinderaker say, no, actually, after the election, it is taking place. And I think the bottom line is very simple, and that is now that the left has won, they are willing to be even more blunt about what they want to do. In case you wonder, well, how political are the ads? He says basically they're just giving information about wasteful state government spending. And since they're located in Minnesota, I'm sure you can come up with some very good examples of that. So here he refers to this whole idea that voter fraud is a crime that must not be mentioned. And now after the election, we are actually having a more difficult time with social media than even before we had the election taking place. Which brings me to another piece by Thomas Gallatin, in which he again reminds us that both the CEOs of Facebook and Twitter appeared on Capitol Hill. And in the exchange between Senator Josh Hawley, who's a Republican from Missouri, and Mark Zuckerberg, Hawley noted that the existence of this task platform is actually if you will, a censorship team that actually exists. And they admitted yesterday, and this is something that others have featured as well, that the censorship teams communicate with their counterparts at Twitter and Google to coordinate their censorship efforts. So there you go. I mean, this is the kind of thing that used to happen when you had the major monopolies where they would make sure that nobody could get through. And so Hawley then said, let me ask you directly under oath, he wanted to make it real clear, does Facebook coordinate in content moderation policies or efforts in any way with Google or Twitter, he says. And Zuckerberg kind of claimed he wasn't sure, but he would say, I expect some level of communication probably happens, which is, of course, a nice way to say, oh, yes, we all figured out who we're going to keep off of the platforms, since the various platforms, whether it's Twitter or Google or Facebook or whatever, we will all make sure that we control all of this. And as a result, you can see this as well. So Ted Cruz, he wasn't going to sit back and just take all of that, effectively hit Dorsey on the issue of free speech and asked questions like, are social media companies, platforms, or publishers? Because if they're platforms, okay, then they are still covered under Section 230 of that federal statute. But if they're going to be publishers and decide who gets to go on the platform and who does not, then they become a publisher and they should no longer have that kind of protection. So there was some back and forth there. Of course, you have Senator Mike Lee and some others. And so what we have had is just a great revelation that indeed these social media platforms are planning to moderate, which is a nice way to say censor anything they disagree with. And more importantly, they are actually going to do what they can to make sure that everybody follows kind of their same type of presentation. And so they're all basically collaborating with each other and communicating and coordinating with each other. At one point, Ted Cruz even asked Dorsey, does voter fraud exist? He says, I don't know for certain. But nevertheless, he did sort of apologize for maybe we shouldn't have posted or actually prohibited the posting of the Hunter Biden story. But he's kind of like, well, now we elected the guy we wanted to elect, so now I'll apologize, because it's always easier to ask for forgiveness than it is to ask for permission. So there you go. Which brings me to one of the articles I have posted for you today by Daniel Glertner. And I was thinking, we've interviewed him before, and I realized, no, we've interviewed David Glertner with a name like that. I suspect they're related, but nevertheless, it's entitled Social Media Censorship Sows the Wind and We All Reap the Whirlwind, because he says that really the first encounter he ever had with social media fact-checking was over something he had posted on Facebook, and it just had something to do with the fact that gun control really didn't work when you are trying to prevent the Holocaust, if nothing else, was a good example of what happens when nobody has any guns and nobody can challenge you. And that was posted by Facebook as something that indeed was a factually incorrect idea. And he said, one problem, with this article is the touchingly naive idea that a complex question over which historians continue to argue could be stamped true or false as though it were a fact you simply had been too lazy to look up. The second problem, he says, is that this fact-checking article is full of factual errors. But that's not surprising, he said, when such articles are generally written by a 20-something journalism school graduate who became, quote, an expert in World War II that afternoon after her supervisor told her to research a meme on the internet. And he said the biggest problem, however, was that Facebook had decided that this question, remote and unimportant as it might be in our daily lives, was not something you should be allowed to think about. If you thought about it yourself, unguided as though you were, say, an adult and not a school child, you might come to the wrong conclusion. Unless you be misled into thinking there was a connection between gun control and tyranny, Facebook had looked into the matter for you, and don't worry, they found there wasn't any connection, so you can rest easy and move on to fluffy kitten pictures. And the point he was making is that you have these individuals that are doing fact-checking, which, as Kelly Shackelford has shared, and I want to get into some of that with him on Friday, are individuals that when you check out who they are, first of all, many times not Americans. Second of all, just as liberal as the day is long. It is hard to find anybody on that fact-checking council that would be the kind of person we would probably interview here on Point of View, which tells you a bias right there. But then back to the point that Daniel Galertner was mentioning, more likely they aren't even necessarily reading all those. There are just too many posts. There are too many things out there. So this is obviously being shoved down to somebody who doesn't know anymore. And when you saw, was it Senator Coons yesterday in this was saying, well, okay, you have this to deal with race, you have this to deal with the voter fraud, but you don't seem to have any kind of standard for climate change. So while you had some people, and this would be like Josh Hawley and certainly Mike Lee and certainly Ted Cruz saying, wait a minute, you are censoring all sorts of things, you had at least one senator, and I'm sure he was just the only one that was verbal about it, saying, oh, no, you need to also have this for everything from climate change, global warming, and a variety of other environmental issues, guaranteeing that if you seriously think that you're going to be able to get honest and fair information on Twitter and Facebook, you are kidding yourself. Now, we can complain about that all we want. We can ask Congress to change the law. Congress won't, because too many of these individuals have been bought off, I would have to say, by social media. Or we can go somewhere else, which is why the other day we talked about Parler and MeWe, and maybe even just saying, don't even pay attention to social media. The quickest way for them to not have the power is for people to not use their resources, and all of a sudden, some of those resources would dry them up. That might be a good thing. Let's take a break. We have a lot more to cover, and we will do so right after this.
Election day has come and gone, so tell me, do people like you need to be more or less vigilant, more or less informed, more or less involved in making an impact? I think the answer is clear. Those who value freedom of conscience and religious liberty need to do more than ever to stand up for what the founders gave us and put America on track for greatness. Yes, we face challenges, but it's in the hard times that the greatest victories are seized and won. I urge you today, right now, to seize this opportunity and join the Point of View Radio Truth Team. Be part of the solution our nation needs. Visit pointofview.net/team or call 1-800-347-5151. The election is not the end of anything. It's another beginning. And when you join the Truth Team, you make it possible for millions of people to get the real news they desperately need and the practical marching orders that Kerby and the team at Point of View Radio give each day. Join us now in this critical moment. Pointofview.net/team. and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
You know, indeed, if indeed, and it's quite likely that, I guess I've given you enough disclaimers now, if Joe Biden does become the next president, is probably a better way to say it, we have a pretty good idea that it is going to be a lot more liberal than anybody would have suspected who voted for him. Now, I think some people understood that, but I would go back to, and love to go back to, the 75 million people that voted for Joe Biden, and first of all, ask them why they did. And it turns out that if you do that in some of the exit polls, many times they weren't necessarily voting for Joe Biden, they were voting against Donald Trump. But even those who voted for Joe Biden, I'm sure they would tell you that he seems like a nice person, he seemed pretty moderate, he's not as extreme. We really need just somebody with kind of a calm sense of attention there. Many of them would maybe not even realize that he's having, obviously, cognitive problems. But if you would like to know what he's going to do, pay attention to who he's already announced he's going to put in his cabinet. One of the articles, which I'll get to in just a minute, is the second article that we've posted, and it comes from, as I mentioned just a few minutes ago, Professor Jonathan Turley, who is a professor of law at George Washington University. Not necessarily a fan of certainly Donald Trump, but apparently not much of a fan either of the kind of people that Joe Biden wants to put in his administration. But before we get to that, we have another good indication. It comes from the press conference yesterday that Joe Biden did. And at press conference, I almost have to put in quotes because he only took a few questions. They were only from friendly reporters, which is, of course, a tactic that Barack Obama used to use as well. And the media was so compliant about that really all they got were softball questions, and most of those set up so that he could just simply attack Donald Trump. Now, if Donald Trump fades away, I'm not sure he will, but if he does, they'll still be complaining about Donald Trump a year from now, even if Donald Trump doesn't even tweet again, because they don't have anything else to complain against. But here's the point. Gary Bauer put it this way: what was evident yesterday is that anybody who thought they were electing a moderate needs to think again. He says, for example, Joe Biden is considering appointing one of the teachers' union's leaders as his Secretary of Education. If you think you're frustrated about the public schools, what you're doing right now, just wait. A member of Biden's transition team and a rumored nominee for Secretary of Treasury is an aggressive supporter of reparations. You know, we have to provide reparations for African Americans. That means that you, who've never owned slaves, will give money to someone who never was a slave to atone for something that happened 150 years ago. And Gary Bauer at this point says, sure, that's going to bring us all together. Joe Biden also suggested he wants to immediately forgive student loan debt. Senate Democratic leader Chuck Schumer, who's the Senate minority leader, is pressuring Biden to eliminate as much as $50,000 of debt per student via executive order. Off air, I was asking about that, and again, that will be interesting, and I think it underscores what we're going to be talking about next hour in terms of how important that Georgia election is, because if indeed you have a compliant Senate, then that will happen. If you don't, I think the Senate can simply say, you know what, we are not going to allow you to allocate the funds necessary to do that. But nevertheless, again, Gary Bauer helps you translate this. All of you who work 2 jobs to pay off your student loans will be instantly turned into suckers, or what I called yesterday the chump effect, which I'm going to write a commentary on. And all of you that currently have student loan who think it won't cost you anything to have it forgiven should have taken an economics class in college, or at least paid more attention to it than Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, because there's no such thing as free money. You and other taxpayers will pay for this debt in higher taxes. Gary Bauer goes on to say, much is being made about the split in the progressive movement between the woke socialist and the rest of the movement. In my view, this divide is being overblown. By now, in the heart of virtually every progressive, there is a socialist yearning to show himself. The split between those like AOC and those are maybe Obama and Biden certainly want to camouflage it, but nevertheless, that is the case. And interestingly enough, And this weekend, we talked about the fact that Joe Biden really didn't say anything about the violence in Washington, D.C. Gary Bauer ends with this by saying Biden did condemn the violence in Washington, D.C. this weekend, but he did not condemn any specific organization like Antifa or Black Lives Matter. And while Biden was concerned about the violence, he was also concerned about the displays of white supremacy during the march. Or is he talking about... Oh, that's right. He thinks MAGA hats are racist. And so it brings us down to another one of the articles I've posted. And I'm quoting again from Jonathan Turley. Recognize this is not a person that ever would vote for Donald Trump. Probably voted for Joe Biden, certainly has identified himself as a Democrat, a liberal, progressive, but not a total progressive because he's the typical liberal, not the leftist, and we've made that distinction. But here's what he said in one particular piece that I think was so powerful. He wrote on his website, for those of us who have been critical of the growing anti-free speech movement in the Democratic Party, the Biden transition team just took an ominous turn. Those are his words. The New York Post reports that Biden tapped Richard Stengel to take the team lead position on the U.S. Agency for Global Media, which, if you're not familiar, includes the Voice of America, Middle East Broadcasting Networks, Radio Free Europe, and Radio Liberty. Turley goes on to write in his website, as I previously addressed in a column, Stengel has been one of the most controversial figures calling for censorship and speech controls. For a president-elect who has just called for everyone to hear each other, he picked a top aide who wants to silence many. Since it would be difficult to select a more anti-free speech figure to address government media policy, one has to assume that Biden will continue the onslaught against this core freedom as president. This is not the first Biden aide to indicate a crackdown on free speech in the new administration, and Biden himself has called for greater censorship on the internet, which I think parallels some of the things we just said a minute ago. Then, interestingly enough, he goes on, because Jonathan Turley's not done yet. He said last year, Stengel wrote a chilling Washington Post op-ed that denounced free speech as a threat to social and political harmony. Like a number of liberal and democratic figures, Stengel struggled to convince leaders that what we need is less freedom. He said, all speech is not equal, and where truth cannot drive out lies, we must add new guardrails. I'm for protecting thought that we hate, but not speech that incites hate, he continues. In January, he goes on to say, Biden called for greater speech controls on the internet and denounced Twitter for allowing others to speak freely, in insisting that tolerating such views in the name of free speech is the same as propagating falsehoods they know to be false. Biden called for companies to bar Trump views on such things as mail-in voting as an invitation for fraud. And, of course, he's not alone. Congressional leaders like House Intelligence Committee Chair Adam Schiff have called for labeling and removing material, with some members directly threatening a legislative crackdown. So, again, just some ominous comments coming from Jonathan Turley about what is indeed unfolding before our very eyes. One last point, whether it's Joe Biden or a variety of others, you might as well just wave goodbye to Thanksgiving if you live in certain states, because right now you have the mayor of Chicago, Lori Lightfoot, calling on residents of her city to cancel traditional Thanksgiving plans. California Governor Gavin Newsom issued a decree severely restricting Thanksgiving gatherings. Governor Andrew Cuomo in New York issued a similar order and suggested that if police see evidence of more than 10 people in a house, they should knock on the door and act accordingly. Some, of course, New York sheriffs are refusing to enforce the order. And then that brings us back to Joe Biden, who yesterday was asked what advice he might have for individuals considering Thanksgiving. He said that family gatherings should be limited to a maximum of 10 people, socially distanced, wearing masks, and people who have been quarantined. So you can see if that's going to be Thanksgiving, just Katie bar the door for what might happen for Christmas as well. And as we've pointed out before, as much as people are convinced that these lockdowns are helpful, we've actually given you some pretty good evidence to suggest that they haven't done what they were intended to do. And keeping people separated from one another is not a good idea, because after all, we need less social distancing. We need more social interaction. And if nothing else, when we come back, we'll spend a little bit of time talking as well about this issue of churches, because that's become a big issue as well, and one that I know we'll hear about from Kelly Shackelford on Friday. Matter of fact, it's kind of interesting. Kelly Shackelford sent me an email last night talking about the Jonathan Turley article, and I said, well, I've already posted it, so you and I are thinking the same thing. Anyway, we'll come back and talk about some other issues right after these important messages.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more hours, because, again, we're going to be talking about a lot of different things over these next couple of hours. And in just a few minutes after the top of the hour, we will get to this whole issue of here is the evidence, and we'll go through that in a little bit more detail. And then we'll talk about some of these other very important issues, especially what's transpiring out of Georgia. But I certainly wanted our Georgia listeners to join us. Perhaps they have some comments about that as well. And then we'll get into to a variety of other topics we haven't covered this hour. We'll spend some time, first of all, talking by about 1:30 with Danny Yohannan and at 2 o'clock with Doug Paul, and then we'll get back to some of these other very important issues that are in the news. And if we don't cover all of them today, of course, we can certainly cover them tomorrow and most importantly on Friday. And in just a minute, I do want to read a little bit about what's happening right now in the courts about churches. Kelly Shackelford will be with us Friday to talk about that. But I was quoting from Gary Bauer, and he was said, one of the things that's so bizarre about this is not only are they telling you that you can't have Thanksgiving dinner together, but they're also telling churches that maybe have the capacity to seat 1,000 people that they cannot have more than 25 people at a service. Well, that's irrational for all sorts of different reasons. If for no other reason than some of these churches that have actually gotten together, not many people, if anybody's getting COVID anyway. And so the question he's asking is the tendency of the church to collapse in front of this pressure because we're told it is emergency, he says, is a dangerous precedent. We've had bad flu seasons that kill 80,000 people. Will churches be asked to shut down for the flu in this future? And, of course, there is going to be more and more attempts, I think, at trying to use this in a very effective way. The next time a jihadist group, Gary asks, threatens to attack a church or synagogue, will be ordered to shut down because the experts say that's the best way to save lives? What about Bible verses are people relying on this kind of reasoning? He says Christians in many parts of the world regularly go to church knowing there are huge risks involved. The church could be blown up or set on fire. They could be gunned down leaving church. Chinese Christians go to church every Sunday knowing that facial recognition technology installed by the Chinese Communist Party is recording them. As a result, their children may not be able to go to college. They may be arrested in the middle of the night by state police. So he said, it's maybe time for American Christians to do a gut check. And it brings me to a piece by First Liberty, because First Liberty Institute has filed a friend of the court brief in the case of Roman Catholic Diocese of Brooklyn versus Cuomo. It's a case in which the Catholic Church there in Brooklyn has asked the Supreme Court to grant an emergency injunction against the various restrictions placed on not only the Catholic Church, but all houses of worship, which was ordered by, again, New York Governor Andrew Cuomo. Some of the comments that are in this are Governor Cuomo's orders unlawfully target religious worship and violate the First Amendment. Courts, they say, must be vigilant to protect fundamental individual liberties for all Americans, especially during a time of crisis. Courts must meaningfully review any order that singles out religious worship as a category for its own unique and burdensome restrictions. And so the argument in this press release is that Governor Cuomo's latest executive order actually imposes restrictions on houses of worship while favoring well over 100 secular nonprofit activities over religiously motivated activities. And attendance at houses of worship capped at 10 or 25 people in certain areas, while the wide range of for-profit activity in these areas are not subject to any capacity limitations, makes no sense. So that is an argument that certainly will be made before the Supreme Court. It is one that right now our friends at First Liberty are dealing with. And I might also point out, I don't want to get too much in the deep weeds here, but also the a very significant brief, friend of the court brief by First Liberty, not only asks for an injunction on this issue, but it also asks the Supreme Court to clarify the widespread misinterpretation of an opinion which is called South Bay United Pentecostal Church versus Newsom, and that is out of California, because they argue, and now I'm quoting, that lower courts across the country are misconstruing this opinion to hold that normal principles of constitutional law do not apply during a prolonged pandemic. Courts have granted an unprecedented level of deference to government officials to impose unequal and discriminatory restrictions on religious exercise, functionally holding that decades of religious liberty precedents are indefinitely on hold. And yet the court case that they cite, the South Bay case, stands for no such thing. But you are seeing more and more, and we may talk about this with Kelly on Friday, that Justice Samuel Alito just the other day, speaking in front of the Federalist Society, said we've gone from a time in which we valued religious liberty to now where religious liberty is always under attack. And so that's a big issue indeed. Just before we take a break, though, and when we come back, we're going to spend some time giving everybody an update on where we are in some of these court cases, the recounts, and all the rest. My commentary today is called Culture War. And the reason I brought it up is because I think we're headed towards a culture war, which is pretty obvious by everything I've said up until now. But when I wrote it last week, I was just seeing, if you will, the intramural war even between those in the Democratic Party. Because I gave you a quote from Claire McCaskill, who's former Missouri senator, and nevertheless said that she felt that the Democrats spent too much time talking about guns and abortion and gay rights and transsexuals and socialism, which is why the Democrats almost lost control of the House of Representatives. And then, interestingly enough, in this particular article that I quote from David Harsanyi, he goes on to even point out that she even felt like she had to apologize for using the word transsexual. And I love what he says. There are probably lots of Americans who have zero clue what McCaskill is sorry about. They believe that letting genetic boys compete with their daughters in track and field is ridiculous. And then points out that in some respects, it wasn't just, as she said, guns, abortion, gay rights, transsexual socialism. It was also the issue of race. And he points out that this constant obsession with race isn't working. Democrats lost ground, if you look at all the polls, with African-American voters, with Hispanic-American voters. So black and Latino voters went more for Donald Trump than ever before. Maybe not because they like Donald Trump as much, maybe they did, but certainly because they just said, we just can't even believe some of the things that are being said right now in the Democratic Party. And so not only did many of them go for Donald Trump, many of them defeated Democrats in power because they were just convinced that if our ultimate goal is racial reconciliation, the progressive use of identity politics, intersectionality, critical race theory, that just doesn't seem to be an answer, even for minority voters. So if nothing else, I conclude by saying I believe that the culture war may be more intense than ever before, because the lesson these elected leaders should take away from this election is that hardcore progressive ideas don't resonate with most Americans. But that doesn't seem to be the lesson they're taking away from this. If anything, they feel even less inclined to hide their agenda and have a plan to fight like never before. And I think just giving you a little bit of a preview of some of the individuals that might find themselves in a Biden administration illustrates the point only so well. Well, is the election over? Not yet, but there is a big bit of evidence we're going to cover in the next few minutes here after we come back from the break to say anybody that says that these statements are being made without evidence just needs to stop using that catchphrase without evidence, because the evidence is pretty overwhelming. And we'll have a chance to hear what Sidney Powell has said as she's been investigating Dominion and Smartmatic. And so we'll get into some of that as well. A lot more to cover, and we will do so right after these important messages.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints commentary at pointofview.net/signup. pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, friends and society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining us. It is the Wednesday edition of Point of View, and boy, do we have a lot to report today in terms of the recounts and in terms of some of the legal issues involved, and we'll see where that takes us. And I think you're going to certainly appreciate some of the material we've posted on the website, because it is there so that you can take advantage of it as well. First of all, one of the first articles is "Here is the Evidence." This comes from Al Perota, and it actually gives you a link to this incredible database that has been put together on all of the allegations, ranging from eyewitness testimony, some of the affidavits, as well as various articles, stories, and all the rest of fraud. And indeed, it gets back to one of the conversations we had here yesterday, because you've heard this catchphrase time and time again, without evidence. And I even quoted yesterday from NPR editor Kelly McBride, who back in September was saying this is becoming kind of a catchphrase at NPR, and it isn't the absence of evidence. It's just maybe the evidence has been reinterpreted or perceived differently. But if you run into anybody now that says, look, there's just no evidence of voter fraud, say, oh, yes, go to hereistheevidence.com. You will find it, and we're going to talk about what's on that in just a minute. But it's a great antidote to this argument that there's no evidence of voter fraud. We're going to spend a fair amount of time talking about Georgia. Matter of fact, those of you in Georgia, we're going to be talking about you a lot right now. But we're also going to do that because people that listen all across the country don't all know all the things happening in your state. Not the least of which is, guess what? They found 2,755 votes that weren't actually there because a memory card from the early voting ballot scanning wasn't uploaded. This is why we do recounts. Guess what? We found all sorts of votes that had not been entered. The estimates are 1,577 for Donald Trump, 1,100 in round numbers for Joe Biden. And nothing to waste. But again, just another thing out of Georgia. Brings us, while I'm talking about Georgia, to something else. I've said before that most of us before the pandemic, maybe I could, but most people probably couldn't tell you who their county judge was, might have been able to tell you who their mayor was. But all of a sudden, the county judge, the mayor, the county health official, they've affected your life in dramatic ways. I wonder how many people in Georgia could tell me what the name of the Secretary of State was in Georgia. I bet you can now, and we'll get into that in just a minute as well. And then we also want to bring some material from Sidney Powell. Remember, I mentioned the other day that she has these affidavits that document that some of the things happening with the Dominion software and Smartmatic are well alleged. I'm going to read some of the material there. And before the 2 hours is up, we also yesterday talked about the chump factor, and at least for our listeners out there in California, you have all sorts of Democrats from the state of California that while you are locked down and while people are telling you not to have Thanksgiving, they're out there enjoying themselves in Maui. That's, again, part of that, what we call the chump effect. That is, you're just being played for a chump. So we've got a lot to cover, but let's cover it one by one. The first article that you can find is called "Here is the Evidence." Al Perota puts it this way. If I had a dime for every time I heard in the past 2 weeks that there is no evidence of fraud in the 2020 election, that accusations of fraud are baseless, I could buy my own multi-million-dollar beach house in Delaware. Of course, he's using the example of where Joe Biden's is. And he said, if I had a dime for every time I heard from the same people who told me Trump colluded with Russia to steal the 2016 election, I could buy a yacht to cruise right up to that beach house. He says, for 2 weeks, we have been presenting bits and pieces of the compelling evidence, the sworn testimonies showing that this election was rigged as any election in Venezuela. Then he goes on and said, oddly enough, the software used in this election was specifically designed to Hugo Chavez's specs, specifically to rig elections in Venezuela. By the way, you're going to hear that in just a minute as we read from Sidney Powell, which has, by the way, been denied as well. And again, I try to give you both sides on this. Somebody's lying. I think I know who it is, but nevertheless, we can figure that out. And this first article is called Here is the Evidence, and that is the website. What you're going to see, and I encourage you to go to the website right now, or else just go to hereistheevidence.com. But if you go to the Point of View websites, the first article, you will see the link. You click on that, and you are going to be scrolling and scrolling and scrolling and scrolling. And this is really aggregators putting this together. So you got all sorts of things. You've got sworn testimony, you've got affidavits, you've got articles, you've got even some that aren't even necessarily related to the 2020 election, but are related to problems in the past with computer software. So there's a lot there. Now, when that is there, will all of that be presented in a court of law? No. As a matter of fact, the article goes on to point out that what individuals are now doing is going through the data and actually trying to figure out what would be most admissible and useful in court. And so, again, it also has the links to this. And he does make one other statement before we get into the next point, and that is it was also a good idea maybe if you want to copy the source links, because as he says, as we've seen in the past 2 weeks, big tech has been desperate to shut down voices that are trying to get the word out. This website could quickly be targeted for deplatforming or denial of service attacks, hacks, and the like. And maybe in the next hour, when I have some extra time after I've interviewed a couple of guests, we'll get into the testimony that took place in the Senate Judiciary Committee on this very important issue, because that also gets us into one of the articles I've posted on social media censorship. And it relates very much to my commentary yesterday on Twitter censorship. But, of course, we had not only Twitter, but Facebook represented. And it just illustrated to me one more time, as I even mentioned in my commentary yesterday, we're going to have to find some alternatives. There is no interest at all between Twitter, Facebook, Google, or anybody else to actually change their policies. And it was kind of interesting because they kind of let it out at one point that they actually work with one another, communicate with one another. So it isn't like, oh, well, maybe I'll get censored on Twitter, but I can try to get my information out on Facebook. No, probably not. They are powerful. They know they are powerful. And one of the articles I have posted on social media censorship tells you how quickly they will censor things that really have nothing to do with the election. And I'll also, when we have some time later, read to you an individual that said, really, I've had no problem with censorship or even having them prevent me from posting my ads until after November 3rd. Because up until now, everybody's been talking about the fact that there's only been censorship of the election. But with what they think is the confirmed election of Joe Biden, they're becoming much more blatant in ways that we've never seen before. But I'm going to have to postpone that to the next hour, because when we come back from the break, I want you to hear from some of the material that Sidney Powell has put together. And we'll talk about what's in the affidavit, as well as some of the questions about the voting machines. So we'll get into that. And then we will transition to one of the interviews I have with Danny Yohannan on fighting global poverty. And then in the top of the next hour, we'll talk with Doug Paul about kingdom innovation. And we'll get back to some of these issues in the news. A lot to cover today. We'll do our best to cover all of it in these 2 hours. And we'll be back right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
You don't hear too many political commentators talking about the culture war these days, but I suspect that term might surface now that the election is behind us. Secular progressive politicians felt that they needed to hide some of their extreme views, but they're going to be more likely to promote them now that the election has passed. At the same time, many of the more moderate Democrats have voiced their concerns that the party lost elections to the House of Representatives because of their controversial messages. Former Missouri Senator Claire McCaskill felt Democrats spent too much time talking about guns, abortion, gay rights, transsexuals, and socialism. David Harsanyi cites some of those criticisms voiced by Democrats and then wonders why some of the candidates complained that they were unfairly labeled socialist. He suggests if that's not the message you want to send, perhaps Nancy Pelosi shouldn't pose with a gaggle of Marxists on the cover of Rolling Stone. He reminds us that McCaskill had to apologize for using the word transsexual. He observes that most Americans have zero clue what McCaskill is sorry about. They may believe that letting genetic boys compete with their daughters in track and field is ridiculous. He also notes that the constant obsession with race isn't working. Democrats lost ground with black and Latino voters. If the goal is racial reconciliation, progressive use of identity politics, intersectionality, and critical race theory doesn't seem to be the answer, even for minority voters. I believe the culture war may be more intense than we've ever seen. The lesson some of the elected leaders should take away from this election is that hardcore progressive ideas don't resonate with most Americans. But that's not what many are saying. Instead, they feel less inclined to hide their agenda and plan to fight like never before. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Anti-Semitism, go to viewpoints.info/antisemitism. Viewpoints.info/antisemitism.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Okay, let's talk about computers and voting machines and a number of other things. And again, we want to come back to the very significant, seemingly almost beyond the pale kind of accusations that have come from Sidney Powell. And as I've said before, if these are right, I mean, this is going to throw everything in this election out. And that's one of the reasons why I give you kind of a point counterpoint, because if nothing else, you need to understand what other people are saying. I know some people have said, I don't know why you showed the other side or give the other side, so that you know it's out there and you know how to respond to it. And it's been amazing to me that if anything, we are going to have to really dig in. And this is a classic illustration where somebody has to be lying. These are situations where they can't both be true. But let me get into this. You might say, okay, who's Sidney Powell? Well, she's a member of Donald Trump's legal team. And she was the attorney of record for Michael Flynn. The other day, she actually read part of the affidavit, which, again, when people swear to this, it's under the threat of perjury. So if they lie, I think we should put somebody, if they're lying on these affidavits, in jail, because they are throwing all sorts of questions about the election. But if they're true, then the people that are denying it, maybe they need to go to jail. Maybe that's a little too strong, but that's kind of my feeling, because this is so significant. So let's just hear what Sidney Powell said. She says, I've just gotten some stunning evidence from a firsthand witness, which has a high-ranking military officer. This is what she told Lou Dobbs on Fox Business. And so she said, I have some of the statements, so let me get to those. So here are the statements. This is now from the affidavit. The actual software was designed designed in a way that the system could change the vote of each voter without being detected. He wanted the software itself to function in such a manner that if the voter were to place their thumbprint or fingerprint on a scanner, then the thumbprint would be tied to the record of the voter's name and identity as having a voter, but that the voter would not be tracked to the changed vote. He made it clear that the system would have to be set up to not leave any evidence of the changed vote for a specific voter, and there would be no evidence to show or contradict the name or thumbprint was going with the changed vote. Smartmatic agreed to create such a system and produce the software and hardware to accomplish the goals of President Chavez in Venezuela. So according to the whistleblower, now I'm not reading, I'm just giving you kind of a summary here, the Smartmatic voting system was implemented in Venezuela in 2006 when President Hugo Chavez actually defeated Manuel Rosales by nearly 6 million votes. The creator allegedly observed multiple elections where manipulated results ended up creating landslide victories. The whistleblower claimed that Smartmatic system was used in the 2013 election following Chavez's death, in this case where you had the election of Nicolas Maduro coming into power. Now, again, going back to the affidavit, Sidney Powell says if one looked at any particular screen, they could determine a vote from any specific area, or as a national total was going to be against either candidate. According to the whistleblower's statement, they could then move them, now I'm not reading directly, but just a summary, from one candidate to another in real time. Powell stated that this took place in another Venezuelan election, and Smartmatic systems were allegedly connected to the internet and fed directly to the control room. And so this article, you might say, okay, I want to read it for myself. The first article is, here is the evidence. It is an incredible catalog and aggregation of all sorts of different claims, which I think should end this idea of no longer can we allow somebody, and if you hear a broadcaster say, the Trump campaign claims without evidence, well, what evidence? How about all this evidence that is huge? So that's the first thing. Number two, what about this computer system? And again, those are the quotes from Sidney Powell. Now, again, I always try to give you the other side because it's really important to understand that. And again, I've received some criticism for it. That's fine. I'm glad to be criticized for it. But I might encourage you to get out your Bible, or if you don't have a Bible with you right now, write down Proverbs 18, verse 17. Because Proverbs 18:17 says that a claim of an individual, I'm paraphrasing, of course, may seem right, until we have a chance to cross-examine. And so it's important to say that, okay, here's the claim. Here's what people are saying right now. This comes from an article that was in the Wall Street Journal, in which the supposed rumor, they say, is that Dominion Computers has a tie to Smartmatic, which I just mentioned a minute ago, which supplied voting systems in Venezuela, where the ruling regime manipulated the elections. Now, here's the part that's in the news. Both companies deny this. Smartmatic says it has never provided Dominion voting systems with any software, hardware, or other technology, and it says that they did not collaborate in any way and have no affiliate ties with them. And so, again, you got to say, maybe those both could be true at the same time, but I don't see how they are. And so you've got some pretty incredible claims being made by Sidney Powell and by the individual that they are reading from the affidavit. And at the same time, you have what's in the news challenging that. I'll let you figure out who's lying. I think we have an idea, but I'll leave it at that. Why are people looking at this in the first place? I'll say this before we take a break. And this goes back to the fact that as you were looking at the Dominion voting system, now I'm moving from Smartmatic to Dominion voting system, you saw something happen in one of the counties there in Michigan. In 2016, Donald Trump won that county with 62% of its 13,600 ballots. So it didn't seem quite right when the initial tallies showed Biden up by 3,000 votes. So in reality, it turns out once they fixed the system, quote, that Donald Trump did win that county by 61% of the vote. The unofficial reporting was wrong, but supposedly the underlying votes were counted correctly. Officials said that in October, the county had to tweak the ballot information for 2 local races. Tabulating machines in the affected areas were updated, but others weren't. And so that's why you got those inaccurate totals. And on Election Day, the differing data didn't line up right after being merged, but the printouts from the tabulator showed accurate actual parts. So again, a lot of that had to do with Michigan, and one of the things that surfaced was you have an inaccurate vote total in one of these counties in Michigan. We're going to spend a fair amount of time today, actually probably next hour, talking about Georgia, but you also have in another county in Georgia where officials had trouble with a Dominion module for adjudicating the absentee ballots. If a voter put a check mark on the circle instead of filling it out, some of those were displayed as in progress, but would not be moved over to being accepted. And so, again, that one may have been nothing more than a problem with user error, but an illustration, I think, again, of some of the questions that have been surfacing. And so these are some articles we've posted for you today in that regard. And, of course, I've also pointed out the fact that you had at least one recount in which we surfaced 2,700 votes that weren't tallied, and so that is the case. We have, of course, in Nevada, which we'll talk about a little bit later, questions over the ballot processing and signature scanning machine, which has caused the Trump campaign now to tell the state of Nevada, simply do not certify the state's vote, which means if you're not certified, then theoretically those electors will not, of either candidate, go to the state capitol to cast their votes. The hope is that this could also be done in places like Georgia and Pennsylvania, and thus neither Donald Trump nor Joe Biden would get 270 electoral votes. And a little bit later, we'll spend some time talking about Georgia because the Secretary of State in Georgia thinks he's got an explanation for why, indeed, Donald Trump didn't do so well in the state when, interestingly enough, you've got other individuals that did relatively well who were Republicans and caused 2 of the senators that are going to be running for this runoff, Kelly Loeffler and David Perdue, calling for the Secretary of State, Brad Raffensperger, to actually step down. So if you don't think we have some controversy after the election, you haven't been paying attention. But for those of you in Georgia, you know the story. But for people in 36 other states, they may not know all the interesting things unfolding right there in the Peach State, which, of course, is going to manifest itself, I suspect, in this runoff election on January 5th. Let's take a break. We've got a lot to cover, but we'll spend some time here. First of all, talking with Danny Yohannan about fighting global poverty. We'll get into a couple of other issues right after this.
Election day has come and gone, so tell me, do people like you need to be more or less vigilant, more or less informed, more or less involved in making an impact? I think the answer is clear. Those who value freedom of conscience and religious liberty need to do more than ever to stand up for what the founders gave us and put America on track for greatness. Yes, we face challenges, but it's in the hard times that the greatest victories are seized and won. I urge you today, right now, to seize this opportunity and join the Point of View Radio Truth Team. Be part of the solution our nation needs. Visit pointofview.net/team or call 1-800-347-5151. The election is not the end of anything. It's another beginning. And when you join the Truth Team, you make it possible for millions of people to get the real news they desperately need and the practical marching orders that Kerby and the team at Point of View Radio give each day. Join us now in this critical moment. pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
For a while, we thought we would change topics because, after all, it's kind of overwhelming, all the things we're trying to process in terms of these recounts and in terms of some of the legal issues. And before the 2 hours is over, we'll get back to those and give you an update on that, as well as some other stories that we've been following, because there are some other things that you need to know about, and you will see many of those articles posted. We'll get into the whole issue of social media censorship. We'll also be talking a little bit later with a guest guest about kingdom innovation for a brave new world, but we thought for just a few minutes we might talk about this issue of global poverty. We understand only so well what we all have been going through in terms of the lockdowns, how the pandemic has affected us, and this in some respects has taken a trend that was going in the right direction, removing more and more individuals from extreme poverty. That was a very significant success that was taking place up until about March or April of this year. And now we're talking about this issue of global poverty hitting in very significant ways. It may be difficult, even inconvenient for you, but it could be really devastating for many of the people that we'll be talking about now. So we wanted, as we especially encourage you to support ministries that not only during Thanksgiving and Christmas, but all through the year are reaching out, that you might want to know about. So we bring to the microphone Danny Yohannan. His father, Kerby Anderson, has been on the program with us before, founder and director of the Gospel for Asia. Danny is now the vice president of Gospel for Asia, has a Bachelor of Theology degree, a Master of Divinity degree. We're going to talk a little bit about fighting global poverty with ideas. And so, Danny, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Thank you so much. It's my privilege to be here.
Can you give us a little bit of a background on Gospel for Asia? Because that is something we've talked about on this program before, but we always have new listeners or others that maybe don't remember too much about the organization.
You know, Gospel for Asia started just over 40 years ago. It actually started with a small prayer meeting in my parents' living room with a couple of their friends, asking the Lord to give them direction in terms of missions and helping some of the poorest in the entire world. And from those small gatherings of just seeking God in prayer, what God has done is raised up thousands and thousands of national workers, people from their own country who know the language, like the food, like the climate, like the bugs, and can easily connect with the people, explaining to them what Christ has done for them. But besides all those things, we've seen tens of thousands of children helped in our Bridge of Hope programs, being able to help see them get educated and have a future. Lots of medical outreach, hundreds of thousands of families every single year touched by the love of God through our Christmas catalog campaign. These are a few of the things that really drive the heart of Gospel for Asia. But, you know, the one thing, the singular thing as Christians, which is really the heart of Gospel for Asia, is this, is to know Christ and then to make him known, especially to places and people that really are still waiting to hear about Christ. Many times we go to these places, these very rural areas, especially in parts of Southeast Asia, and we'll literally ask someone, do you know Jesus? And typically the response will be something to this effect. You know what? I've lived here my whole life. My family's here. My friends are here. My relatives are here. Your friend Jesus is not here. Maybe check the next village down that particular road, and you might be able to find your friend Jesus. That is what really, really drives us is while we celebrate and we are grateful for all that God has done in our life, and we're right about to head into the Advent season, to realize that half the world still waits to hear about Christ and Christmas and anything that has to do with God's love. And, you know, we want them to celebrate with us the goodness of God in their life also. And so there's a dual aspect of really wanting to meet people's needs and to uplift them out of their struggle and their poverty and their challenges. At the same time, we want them to know that Christ loves them deeply, and if we can do that practically and tangibly, then we are able to accomplish what we see in the Great Commission that Christ has given to us.
One of the things that you just said was an example that I've used before. I had a colleague that was actually in Nepal, but same thing, talking about Jesus, and finally some of those around through the translator said, well, we would love to meet this person, Jesus. Which one of you is Jesus? You know, so again, you don't have the recognition that individuals take for granted here in this country, whether it is a post-Christian culture or a Christian nation. We take for granted so much of that. But talk about what are some of the needs right now, because you're trying to sponsor so many of children for education, medical care, and just right now, just even a daily meal, because when we talk about a lockdown here, we still have the ability for many individuals to be able to go online and carry on their business. If you tell a day laborer to no longer leave his house, you know the impact that that has on the family. So what are some of the kinds of needs that you're running into right now in Gospel for Asia?
Yeah, I think it's important to realize that the whole world has been affected by this COVID-19 situation, whether it's highly politicized or whether it's fear-based. I mean, whatever the reasons and backing behind things, every single person has experienced some kind of difficulty or trauma. I mean, just the fact in the West that we were fighting over toilet paper tells you that we literally almost lost our minds over what was important in life. And we'll probably look back on this time and see there was a lot of fear that drove a lot of these things. But the reality is, whatever the cause and whatever the fear that's caused this, so many places in some of the areas we work in Southeast Asia have suffered tremendously. Literally tens of millions of day laborers, and these are people who are very far away from their homes. They might have migrated, interculturally to different states or different places within a country to find work, and all of a sudden, everything is shut down. Everything is locked down. It isn't simply an inconvenience that you have to wear a mask or you can only go to the stores at certain times or you're limited to the number of, packages of macaroni that you can buy. This literally is, there is no work, which means there's no food. And then, so what do? The money that you were making, you were sending back home to support your family. And so it's a completely devastating effect. On top of that, you have kids who can't continue their schooling. And so for us here, the biggest, struggle, and even for my kids, it was, the internet's not working perfectly, and, my computer didn't work, and Zoom is not, syncing up and all these things. There are reports in places that are very rural where there is no internet, there's no electricity. And so there's, a teacher that stands in the middle of the village with a megaphone and yells out the lessons, and all the kids are on their porches listening to the lessons, trying to, get by with some lessons. In other places, the government is having teachers go on national television in that particular language, and you have to tune in for your lesson at the right time. But so many tens of thousands of kids can't even continue their schooling, which means they can't get into college, which means the workforce is impacted economy. And so right now, probably the single biggest issue right now with COVID in places like India or Nepal, Sri Lanka, is this, that you typically would have hundreds of thousands and hundreds of thousands of people who would typically be begging on the street, and there's no one to beg from. Day laborers, there is no work for them to engage in. Kids that used to go to school now can't go to school, and the biggest issue is starvation. It's not inconvenience; it's actually starvation. Where what do they do? There's no food. And so the biggest killer right now is not going to be dying from COVID. It's going to be dying from starvation. That's what we're seeing. And so we've literally seen, hundreds and even thousands of our parishes on the mission field. They were cooking daily kind of ration packets. One of our parishes, we found out this is like a week or two after the whole COVID situation, lockdown was extreme months ago. They were cooking like 500 food packets a day. Wow. And just distributing it to the people that are going to the street. Some of our bishops and others, they just were trying to meet the needs of the people that were facing, just dire consequences in the straits. So we met one family. He was, a migrant worker with his family, and he had rode his bicycle with a little wagon, carrying his family on the back for 1,200 miles. And he said we hadn't eaten in days. And so this is the now reality. This is what's happening right now and will continue.
Sure.
And, it may not be mainstream news, and so people don't realize it, but
that's why we're talking about it today.
Starvation is the biggest thing right now. Yes.
We're going to take a break, and when we come back, we'll continue for a few more minutes. Danny Yohannan, and again, this is Gospel for Asia, gfa.org, and we have information about that on our website. We'll continue that conversation right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Time for a few more minutes with Danny Yohannan. Again, he is the Vice President of Gospel for Asia. And just before we let you go, Danny, let's talk about action items, because we have a link to Gospel for Asia, gfa.org. And people don't even have to remember that, because we have a link on our website, and they can click on your picture and find their way there. But there's a way in which people can sponsor a missionary, children, help with disaster relief, and a number of other things. So as people have heard these incredibly powerful and really heart-rending stories, what can our listeners do to help out?
You know, I think there are three practical things that people can do. One is something that everyone can do, is to pray. And I know that sounds like a very cheap option, but it is one of the most important options. I mean, even Christ says, disciples pray, Lord, harvest and more laborers in the field. Prayer is one of the most significant things people can do. Why? Because it touches and changes our own heart. It helps us to lift up our eyes off of our own little world and self and see a world out there that is desperately waiting for Christ. And so I would encourage people, take 10, 15 minutes a week and pray. Get the family together and pray. I would challenge every church this coming Sunday, take 5 minutes out of the service and pray for the needs of the world and for God's work around the world. It's very significant. Second, I would encourage people to go to our website, gfa.org, or click on the link, like you said on the banner, and look and explore what you can get involved in, either in time and resources, and connect with what God is doing around the world. One of the most significant things that people can do is get engaged with opportunities for people to come to know the love of Christ practically and tangibly. And I believe Gospel for Asia is one of the best out there. Most people don't realize we put more water projects in around the world than anyone else. And it's just something amazing to see how even simple water can change people's lives. And third is, everyone's got social media. And right now, with all kinds of crazy rhetoric and all kinds of crazy stuff going on, I would encourage people to use your social media. Bring awareness for people to engage in action, not just awareness, but action with people, with places that are doing good for God, God's work in places like, what Gospel for Asia is working in. And so these are some practical things. Prayer, doing what we can with our resources, time, energy, finances, and then using our social media to encourage other people to do the same. And this is one of the things that we can practically be doing to help expand God's kingdom.
While you were talking about social media, I thought another idea that I had is that you have about a 3-minute video introduction to that, which is on YouTube, but it's also on your website, gfa.org. People can click the share button there and put it on their Facebook page or Twitter post, or send it to maybe their pastor in charge of missions, or maybe to somebody that has a real heart for this, because as you pointed out, the circumstances are just almost overwhelming right now. In just a minute, I'm going to talk about the vaccines that have been developed and the hope to maybe get us something back to what looks like normal in the future. But for us, it has been difficult. It's been an inconvenience. It maybe even been financially stressful. But it's sometimes a matter of life and death for some of the people we're talking about in the countries where you minister, isn't it?
Absolutely. It's just like what you said. It's not just an inconvenience, but it is one of those realities of life and death, whether it's food or it's education or it's vaccine. This is where, unless we engage our heart and our thinking and our emotions and actually pay attention to what is happening, we will be consumed with just our own little life and our own little struggles and problems, and we will never be able to follow Christ fully. Like what he said is to deny ourselves, pick up our cross, and follow him, which means we do things on purpose in order to engage our heart and our whole life in the worship of God, but also in the activities of what God is doing. And I would really, really encourage people, don't think that missions and these kinds of activities are things for special people or just missionaries or pastors. It is for everyone. Every Christian is called to expand the kingdom, to do everything possible to see more and more people come to know the name of Christ. And that is our singular goal in life, is to know him and then to make him known.
Danny, I appreciate you being on the program, and wish you well there at Gospel for Asia.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Just before we take a break, I did mention the vaccine. I thought I'd mention that now because after we get back into some of the other issues in the news, this will probably fade away. But one of the things that was so intriguing is the other day we were talking about Pfizer. Now they actually have further research that now shows that the vaccine for them is about 95% effective. You might remember when they made that announcement a while back of about 90% effective. That was based on about 94 infections that had been counted. But today you have now the company has accumulated 170 infections in the study, said only 8 of them occurred in volunteers who actually got the vaccine rather than a dummy shot. And that's, of course, always one of the great challenges because you oftentimes give them a placebo in order to gain the kind of gold standard necessary to actually be implemented by the Food and Drug Administration. And so now they're planning very quickly to try to get confirmation in that regard. And so 95% effective, about 94% effective in adults over the age of 65. And so that's kind of intriguing. And the other day, of course, we announced that Moderna announced that with its vaccine, it appeared to be about 94.5% effective as well. So both Pfizer and I think soon Moderna will be looking to get emergency authorization from the Food and Drug Administration. Quite possible that some of those vaccines would be made available. Now you might say, okay, who gets them first? Usually the principle is the first responders will receive the vaccine and those people who are at high risk. And so those would be some of those individuals. As I've said before, there are a good number of Americans that have said they may not take the vaccine. So we'll see how that plays itself out. But at least according to Pfizer and BioNTech, which is the German company they're associated with, they expect to produce 50 million vaccine doses globally this year and up to 1.3 billion doses by next year, 2021. In the United States in particular, since we were talking global a minute ago, let's come back to the United States here. The United States hopes, officials in America here hope that there would be about 20 million vaccine doses each from Moderna and Pfizer. So that'd be 40 million vaccine doses. And those would be available primarily to vulnerable groups and first responders, people with serious health conditions. And, of course, for those of you, for example, in the state of New York, you know, Governor Andrew Cuomo said, I'm not sure this is going to be something we want to use. We don't trust the Trump administration. And so Donald Trump the other day made it very clear. He said, well, if you don't want the vaccines, we won't send them up there, but we'll see where that plays itself out. And, of course, you wouldn't especially want to send the one from Pfizer because it has to be stored at a very low temperature with dry ice, and that's much more difficult than the Moderna one, which looks like it only needs to be refrigerated. But if nothing else, good news that maybe a vaccine will stem the tide. No guarantees. And, of course, there will be all sorts of discussions we'll probably have in the future about this. But I wanted to put that on the table as maybe some good news in the midst of certainly with some things we've been talking about in terms of the problem and the incredible challenge of global poverty. So we take a break. When we come back, Doug Paul will be with us. We'll talk briefly about his book, Kingdom Innovation for a Brave New World. Then we'll get back into some of these issues in the news, especially some of these lawsuits, social media censorship. You had the heads of both Twitter and Facebook in front of the Senate Judiciary Committee, and we've learned some rather ominous news from that. Also looked at one of the individuals that, if indeed Joe Biden becomes president, he wants to put in a position of leadership who is just an anti-speech zealot. That doesn't come from me. That comes from a man who's a law professor at George Washington University. We'll be back with more right after this.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/signup. pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of view, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
You know, yesterday when we spent some time talking with George Barna, we spent some time talking about some of the trends in America. And of course, when we've had Dave Kinnaman on with the Barna Research Group, they are all concluding that about 1 in 3 people who were attending church before the lockdowns, before the COVID pandemic, are no longer attending any church service in person or online. And so you know that we've talked about the decline in interest on the part of this. We've got a millennial roundtable where we've had some of that conversation. My own organization's just finished one of the most extensive surveys of the so-called nones, those individuals that actually are atheist, agnostic, or no preference. And so if we want to actually be able to develop something that looks like church in the 21st century, especially after we come out of the lockdown, after we address this pandemic, we need to begin to think about certain kind of innovation. And so in a minute, you might want to get something to write with, because we're going to talk about 5 phases of what is called kingdom innovation. It's part of this book, Kingdom Innovation for a Brave New World, and some endorsements coming from individuals we've had on this program, people like Mark Batterson and Gabe Lyons and others. It is written by Doug Paul. He is an executive with Catapult, which is an innovation and activation shop, serves as a pastor and elder in a church in Richmond, Virginia, a graduate of Wheaton College. And Doug, thank you so very much for joining us today here on Point of View.
Thanks so much for having me. Great to be here.
Let's talk about the genesis of this. It seems like, and reading your book, you're kind of a sound sleeper like I am. And so if I wake up in the middle of the night and I feel like God has woke me up, something must be going on. And that's really kind of the genesis of this, isn't it?
Yeah, we like everyone else, were just befuddled by what was happening with COVID. None of us have experienced this in our lifetime. And I actually am a pretty sound sleeper, and I had 3 nights in a row where it just felt like the Lord was waking me up at about 3 in the morning to just get up and pray. And by the end of the 3rd night, I just had a real sense that the Lord was giving a picture for ways that we could come alongside of the church, because our sense was that people were going to be inundated with all kinds of information, that their inboxes in March, April, May were just going to be a sea of good information, but they had no idea what to do with it. And there were leadership decisions that they were going to have to make, and they were going to have to innovate and adapt really, really quickly, and they had no idea how to do that. And so what we ended up doing was just starting some coaching groups for churches across the United States. And we thought maybe we would get 50, maybe on a good day, maybe 100, and we ended up with about 10,000 leaders.
Wow.
In these coaching groups.
And again, the book really goes through in quite a bit of detail, so we're going to give it a chance for people to first hear about it and then get a copy of it. About 250 pages with some great information about what is called identification, ideation, experimentation, mobilization, and multiplication. But before we get into some of that, I gave just one or two of the facts and figures, but we have been seeing for some time a decline, even before the pandemic, even before people even knew what the word COVID meant, in terms of individuals who had any kind of religious affiliation. You've got a graph that's kind of mind-boggling in some respects, because you look at the percentage of any affiliation. Doesn't matter whether it's Protestant, Jewish, Catholic, Muslim, whatever. But in some respects, this has been going on even before the pandemic. But now, since then, we see some very concerning trends, don't we?
We do. And I think what we're realizing, and you see this a lot of times with crisis, is that crisis doesn't necessarily, it sometimes does, but very rarely does new things. It accelerates things that are already happening. And with COVID, I think, and you mentioned the Barna research, I think that's what you're seeing. You have had for quite some time in the American church a group of people that are often called nominal Christians. They might be more culturally Christian, civic Christian, but when, like the running joke that we have on our team is that you had a group of people that they discovered that there's this thing called brunch. And on Sunday mornings, it turns out that they like brunch a little bit more than they do being in their faith community, whether that's online or in person. And I think there's a question right now that's like, are they going to come back? And my sneaking suspicion is that most of them are not.
And so, again, that's a real concern. We have information about this book, which you, I no doubt, will be able to find in your local bookstore, but it's available in paperback and Kindle. Ready or Not, Kingdom Innovation for a Brave New World. Let's start the process, because there are 5 phases of this. And the first is what you call identification, learning how to kind of frame the start of this journey, kind of locating what you call the big idea and trying to learn how to frame the problem. And as we all know, sometimes when you can identify the problem, you're going to be much more successful in being able to address it, aren't you?
Yeah, and this is about asking the right questions. And I think sometimes when we're looking at something that isn't working, we ask, how do we fix it? And so, like, if you've got a small group system that isn't working, or Sunday school, or whatever it is, you're like, well, how can we fix this thing? But the thing to actually ask is to say, why did we start this in the first place? What was the original problem that we were trying to solve? And I think one of the things that you see pretty quickly is if you start asking why questions, think about Simon Sinek, and he talks about start with why. When you start asking why questions, which end up being bigger questions, it can open the opportunity for us to see different answers to those questions.
One of the things I love about your book, I might just compliment you as well, and this showed up in some of the reviews, is you're a great storyteller. Even in this first chapter, you take us through Thomas Alva Edison trying to find smart people and coming up with a test, and finally actually identifying one of those individuals, Bill Wilson, who then ends up not actually working with Edison. And, of course, he's best known for AA and all sorts of others. And all through this book, you have just incredible stories, kind of riveting stories, which sometimes give you a sense that we've been here before and we kind of learn our way through some of this. So let me take a break. I want to get through some of the other phases as well, because in a 250-page book, we can't cover all of it, but we wanted to help people understand that this may be just the kind of book that you need if you're struggling with, where's my church going? Is this really working? Are we always going to be doing church through Zoom? And really, even is the model that we have for church working in my particular community? Those are really important questions you want to ask, number one. But when we come back from the break, we'll move from identification to what's called ideation. In other words, trying to figure out how to maybe generate some new practices, maybe some new concepts, maybe even new ways of thinking if you're going to try to actually deal with the challenge of innovation. Then, of course, experimentation, mobilization, and multiplication. And these are some resources that I just thought would be very helpful, because as we look around, now that we're kind of getting past the election, although we'll be talking about that later this hour, we still see some things that are not right about what's going on inside the church buildings and even outside the buildings, and the way in which we're communicating, online services and all sorts of things. Perfect time to reevaluate what we're doing and to recognize that the definition of insanity is just let's just keep doing the same thing and expecting different results. And that never works out. So we'll be back right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
You don't hear too many political commentators talking about the culture war these days, but I suspect that term might surface now that the election is behind us. Secular progressive politicians felt that they needed to hide some of their extreme views, but they're going to be more likely to promote them now that the election has passed. At the same time, many of the more moderate Democrats have voiced their concern that the party lost elections to the House of Representatives because of their controversial messages. Former Missouri Senator Claire McCaskill felt Democrats spent too much time talking about guns, abortion, gay rights, transsexuals, and socialism. David Hersani cites some of those criticisms voiced by Democrats and then wonders why some of the candidates complained that they were unfairly labeled socialist. He suggests if that's not the message you want to send, perhaps Nancy Pelosi shouldn't pose with a gaggle of Marxists on the cover of Rolling Stone. He reminds us that McCaskill had to apologize for using the word transsexual. He observes that most Americans have zero clue what McCaskill is sorry about. They may believe that letting genetic boys compete with their daughters in track and field is ridiculous. He also notes that the constant obsession with race isn't working. Democrats lost ground with black and Latino voters. If the goal is racial reconciliation, progressive use of identity politics, intersectionality, and critical race theory doesn't seem to be the answer, even for minority voters. I believe the culture war may be more intense than we've ever seen. The lesson some of the elected leaders should take away from this election is that hardcore progressive ideas don't resonate with most Americans. But that's not what many are saying. Instead, they feel less inclined to hide their agenda and plan to fight like never before. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Anti-Semitism, go to viewpoints.info/anti-Semitism. Viewpoints.info/anti-Semitism.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Ready or not, it is Kingdom Innovation for a Brave New World. Doug Paul with us. Might just mention, in addition to the 250 pages, there's a whole section on the Leader Innovation Lab and some coaching and a way to sharpen your skills and all sorts of other great resources. So if you find yourself saying, okay, I probably would like to get the book, but I also need some other resources. Of course, there's a great connection to his website there as well. But Doug, take us through some of these others, because we talked about identification, ideation. This is the idea of really trying to figure out if I can generate new practices, new concepts, new ways of thinking. What about that?
Yeah, it's in this particular phase that we really identify what I call the villain of our story, which is what's called the curse of knowledge.
Yes.
And what's so fascinating about this is something happens that isn't intuitive, which is the more expertise that you have about something, the better that you get at something, the harder it is to see new ways of doing it. And one of the principal ways of defeating the curse of knowledge is by bringing in people with different voices, different expertise, who will see the problem differently than you do, and actually being open to different points of view, ironically, for what it could look like for different ways out. And really, one of the things that we talk about is this idea of the moonshot.
Yes.
which is
You talked about
taking,
that. Yeah.
coming up with an idea that is so big that it will break whatever it is that you're currently doing, and thinking like, okay, if we were to reach the moon, if we were to actually take a man from Cape Canaveral and get them to the moon, what would we need to do to get them there? And it not only breaks what you're currently doing, but it's gonna force you to think about things that you would never have thought about before. But you want to do that within the context of a group of people with varying points of view and expertise.
And again, I love that moonshot rule because in some respects, that's one more way to get you out of the box that you have.
Exactly.
And I've, over the years, since I have a science background, have been struck by, and maybe even need to write a book on it. I've sort of mentioned it in one book, the number of breakthroughs that took place in science by people that didn't have a scientific degree in that particular field. It's just fascinating, and I think it illustrates the point you're making. Well, okay, so you got a great idea. Now it's experimentation. You launch it, you test it, you adjust it, you relaunch it. So in some respects now you're kind of trying to figure out how to reconfigure all of that, because it may be a real good idea and you take it out of the laboratory into the world and it didn't work so well. So what about that?
Well, so ironically, this is the step that I feel like most leaders in churches skip because we are so used to program-based church. And so we will go from an idea looking good on a piece of paper, and then we will scale it for everyone in the church. And we won't actually know if the idea works yet. And in fact, what we know is that most ideas don't work the first time, or you may not have the right idea. You might have the right principle. You might have the right paradigm, but you don't have a working practice yet. And so what we need to do in the experimentation phase is before we go in, we actually say, like, how do we know if this thing is working or not? And then we push out the simplest version of it, like a beta, prototype, and just do it with a few people, whatever that might be, and see if it actually reaches the marks that you're trying to hit before you ever think about scaling it. Make sure it works first.
And so, again, that makes some sense because, and of course, lots of times the head of a church or a Christian organization oftentimes is kind of a visionary leader. And so they're moving too far down the road and they don't have that experimental part. And sometimes you need to readjust it to make some sense out of it. But let's say we've done that. We've even figured out, okay, this prototype is working. We've tested it. We've actually have some measurable goals and been able to achieve it. That still leads to other points. And one is mobilization. And that is we need to know why and how it works so that you can figure out how to mobilize and multiply it. And so in some respects, paying attention during the experimentation phase is going to be very helpful in terms of what you're going to do during the mobilization phase, won't it?
Exactly. And that's like, if you're paying attention through the whole process, you're noticing that you're designing with the end in mind. The end in mind is you want whatever that kingdom innovation is to spread to as many people as possible. And so in the phase that you're talking about with mobilization, you're asking, okay, we had this experiment. It worked. Great. Why did it work? And then how can we distill it down to its simplest form so that we can train other people to use it, so that we can remove as many barriers as possible so that it can get into the hands of as many people as possible. And that's really the actual scientific label of that is codification. We're trying to distill it down and to codify a reproducible pattern and process that people can use. And it's just everyday people. It can't be like the smartest and the brightest. It's got to be like everyday people can use this thing.
Right. And again, you get buy-in at that point. I love you got a picture here of somebody dancing, and sooner or later somebody else is dancing with them. You know, it's kind of like it's the whole idea of buy-in and those kinds of things. But to keep the train moving down the road, let's get to the last one, multiplication. Okay, we've come up with the idea. We've experimented with it. We've mobilized it. Now we have to make it scalable and try to figure out, are there some barriers that are going to keep this from being effective? And also, how can we get a buy-in and as many people as possible working with that? So what does that look like?
It's really addressing, like, what are the key reasons that this this innovation won't spread? Like, what are the barriers to it? And what do we need to do to lower the barriers as much as we can? So one of the principles we talk about is what's called a radical minimum. And it's saying we're going to identify just a few things that we are going to ask everyone to do. And like as a simple rule of thumb, Those things are probably going to be difficult, but we're not going to ask everyone to do everything. We're going to ask the people who have said yes, because we want to work with the willing, to do a few hard things, not everything. And at the end of the day, what happens with that is that you get sort of like a pure version of that DNA that's kind of embodied in that radical minimum. And so, like, if you think about a radical minimum for AA, it's like, look, there are lots of things that you can do to stay sober, but at the end of the day, you got to have a sponsor. Like, that is a radical minimum. You've got to go to one of the AA meetings. Like, these are radical minimums. There are lots of things you can do to stay sober, but these are two things that you've got to do.
So again, how can people use this book? Because I wanted to give you a chance to maybe provide a resource, because some people right now may be in church leadership. They could be an elder, a deacon, they could be a mission pastor, they could be the senior pastor, they could be all sorts of individuals that are saying, what we're doing right now is not working, we're losing members, and there needs to be some kind of innovation that we implement. So how can they use this book, and maybe even how can they connect up with you to find out some of this information that they can apply to their own church or circumstance?
So in the book, the way that I've written it is that at the end of every phase, there's what I call Leader Innovation Lab.
Right.
And it's taking the principles that we talked about and the stories that we unpacked, and we start to help leaders apply it and integrate it into their own life and leadership. And as you mentioned, we've got some video trainings and stuff that go with that. But at the end of the day, I didn't want to write a book that was content for the sake of content. I wanted to write something that would be a resource to people who are in the pews of churches, or at these days, like maybe on a Zoom meeting. And so, like, it was written with that in mind. If this is something that you're interested in, you can, pick it up on Amazon, iBooks. We've got an audiobook that's about to come out. And if you want to get in touch with me, you can go to dougpaul.org. Not because I'm an org, but because .com wasn't available.
Well, and I think it's very good because we do have a link to that on your website. So it's on our website, pointofview.net. And, of course, then they can find all the information there. They can find out about the book, buy it there if they'd like. We also, of course, have a link so that you can get it both in paperback and Kindle. And I just appreciate you taking the time to join with us. And let's see if we can kind of launch this idea and maybe come back a little bit later and see how it's played out across the nation. So, Doug, it's been a delight to have you on the program, and thank you for writing the book, and thank you for giving us some time today here on Point of View.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me, Kerby.
We are going to take a break, and when we come back, okay, those of you in Georgia, we're going to pay attention a little bit here. We have a few extra votes that were found in Georgia. At the same time, there are a few people that are wondering whether the Secretary of State of Georgia should actually be stepping down. Of course, some people want the governor to step down, too, so we'll get into that. And that is a little concerning because we have two senatorial elections taking place in Georgia. So this is going to be a little Georgia heavy for a moment, and then we'll get back into it because, certainly Joe Biden is convinced he's the president in the future. And so this is a very significant warning from, of all people, Jonathan Turley, who's not necessarily a conservative or anybody like that, but nevertheless, an individual is a Democrat, a law professor at George Washington, who says that the Biden transition team just took an ominous turn and in some respects are starting to put all sorts of anti-free speech zealots in that transition team. So that's not good news, and it's just something to pay attention to as well. So we're going to be looking at that. And most importantly, let's open up the phones. I suspect some of you have some comments you want to make. 1-800-351-1212. We'll take a break, come back with more right after this.
Election day has come and gone. So tell me, do people like you need to be more or less vigilant, more or less informed, more or less involved in making an impact? I think the answer is clear. Those who value freedom of conscience and religious liberty need to do more than ever to stand up for what the founders gave us and put America on track for greatness. Yes, we face challenges, but it's in the hard times that the greatest victories are seized and won. I urge you today, right now, to seize this opportunity and join the Point of View Radio Truth Team. Be part of the solution our nation needs. Visit pointofview.net/team or call 1-800-347-5151. The election is not the end of anything. It's another beginning. And when you join the Truth Team, you make it possible for millions of people to get the real news they desperately need and the practical marching orders that Kerby and the team at Point of View Radio give each day. Join us now in this critical moment. pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Final half hour, if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Going to focus a little bit of time on Georgia, and I might just, as a program note, say, we're going to be doing this for some time. Georgia's going to be on our mind, if I can use the pun or paraphrase a little bit. We're going to have Georgia on our mind because, after all, we've got the recount taking place, and I do want to talk about that. We have 2 U.S. Senate races that will happen in a runoff in January 5th, and more money and time and energy is going to be put into those 2 races probably than in the history of Georgia politics. So we'll just talk about that. Just as a program note, let me also mention that tomorrow we have Linda Turkis with us for a little bit. We have Richard Land with us, O.S. Hawkins, and of course we'll give you an update on some of these other recounts, some of these legal issues, and of course Friday will be Penna Dexter, Kelly Shackelford, and I'm sure they've got lots to say about that as well. 2 times so far in the recount in Georgia, we found extra votes. What a surprise. That's why we do the recounts. The one that's the most significant, I just mentioned earlier, 2,755 votes just all of a sudden showed up because guess what? The memory card from the early voting ballot scanning wasn't uploaded. So that's why we do the counts. Now, that being said, they're not finding enough that seem yet to overturn the vote in Georgia. Gabriel Sterling, who is the director of election operations in the state, has argued that the majority of counties in the state found no significant discrepancies between the election night totals and the recount, except for those. And of course, you had a smaller batch of about 284 from Walton County as well. So you got a couple of counties where that was different. But nevertheless, it at least gives us a more accurate count. That also is kind of related to what is unfolding there in Georgia. There are quite a number of individuals, including the 2 individuals running for the U.S. Senate, who, if I've understood it correctly, and I'm just reading between the lines, seem to be calling for the Georgia Secretary of State, who is a Republican, Brad Roethlisberger, to actually step down. So we'll see where that goes in that regard. His argument was, well, yes, we do see a difference between the number of people that voted for Donald Trump compared to the number of people that voted for David Perdue or Kelly Loeffler or Doug or a variety of other people that were Republicans or whatever. And he said, well, about that 24,000 of the Republicans who voted absentee in the primary did not vote in the general. So that's why it is the case. And there's some people that said, I just don't even believe this. Are we supposed to believe that 24,000 faithful Republicans who voted via absentee ballots in the primary actually then decided not to vote because Donald Trump scared them away because of the fraud with mail-in ballots? And I don't know. We'll leave that there, but it's just another one of those stories out of Georgia. And I recognize that a vast number of our listeners are not in Georgia, but Georgia is going to be a story we're going to be talking about for some time. And if you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. Love to hear from a few of you in Georgia because you are the center of election information. But just to be fair, let me move from Georgia to Nevada, because we have listeners in Nevada as well. And it turns out that yesterday the Trump campaign announced a lawsuit in Nevada over the ballot processing and signature scanning machines that are used throughout the state. There are allegations from observers, and you can find some of that in the material we've posted there, which is called Here is the Evidence. And I might just mention that again. I know people kind of tune in and tune out. And if you didn't hear at the start of this program, there is a piece called Here is the Evidence. It's our first article, and it actually takes you to a website which is entitled hereistheevidence.com, and it documents all of the different allegations. Some of them are news stories. Some of them are affidavits. There are all sorts of resources there. And if you haven't seen that, that is certainly one of those issues. And anyway, back to the lawsuit. And I see one of my calls when it gets into the question of a lawsuit there in Georgia. Which, by the way, can I raise another question? And that is, if we pick up some of these extra votes for Donald Trump, would it be possible, I guess most people saying not likely, that enough votes would be picked up for David Perdue so that wouldn't have to be a runoff? It's just a question. So since right now all they're doing is counting the presidential ballots, is it possible that a recount for him might no longer make that a runoff? And it's probably not likely, but I just thought I'd raise the question. Maybe some of you in Georgia know the answer to that one. But nevertheless, go back to Nevada for a minute before I take some of my phone calls. And that is, there have been a couple of issues. First of all, observers were denied access to the machines, issue number one. Issue number two, there were some outreach programs which were really geared to the Native American Indians, which I did not know about, which they believe, they argue, were resulting in vote buying. And so they argue that this could have impacted as many as 40,000 votes. So again, reading from the lawsuit for just a minute, the lawsuit said, even though election officials were warned about these dangers, they persisted in implementing an election plan devoid of protections that could have prevented or discouraged malfeasance from third parties. Consequently, the fraud and abuse came with the election. This contest is a natural result, as evidence will show that the nature and scale of the fraud and abuse renders the purported results of the Nevada election illegitimate. And so if indeed the Trump campaign can at the very least argue that since we really don't know who won in the state, then the state should not certify the election, and that then would prevent those electors from going to the state capitol. Now, it is an interesting strategy. Alan Dershowitz has been on this program before, not necessarily a Trump fan at all. Nevertheless, was on a program the other day saying, it's a pretty risky one, but who knows? It's quite possible that if indeed you could, through the campaign, and that's a real big question, convince a number of states that because of the questions we just raised a few minutes ago, for example, of the Dominion machines and some of the other issues, that we just do not have a fair election that took place in that state. Thus, we should not certify that election. And if you don't certify the election, then you can't send the electors to the state capital, and that could be, of course, Atlanta, Harrisburg, wherever. And so that's a possibility, and it certainly would then essentially throw the election into the House of Representatives. But let's take some phone calls. I know all of you would like to address some of these issues, so let's head to Georgia first of all. And it's Gaddy. Thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Yes, sir. Thanks for having me. I just was listening to y'all speaking about Georgia a few minutes ago. And one of the things that I've been having conversations with my friends, several of which are in politics and in the state level and whatnot, is that our system we thought was very secure, very reliable. But what we're finding with all these votes, like you were saying, a couple counties finding thousands of votes or hundreds of votes. There was a court filing today in Fulton County, which is the county that was at the center of the controversy about shutting down overnight. A court filing today that person went under oath saying that they were there in the World Congress Center watching these votes come in, the absentee ballots, and they saw case after case. And again, this person went on the record saying cases of ballots, 100% Biden votes. We're talking about tens of thousands of votes counted where no other candidate got a single vote. There were no down ballot votes at all, and that they were brought in by outside sources. One of the craziest things, because again, I'm not a conspiracy theorist by any means, but when I went to register for my absentee ballot in my county, because I'm actually going to be in Texas on the day of the election, you could mail it in or you could email your application in. So I decided to email it to make it quicker, and just to kind of show you how our system is not necessarily the most trustworthy. I wasn't emailing my official application with my signature back into or .gov account or anything like that. It was emailed to an @gmail.com account.
Wow.
That was the official. So
boy.
Some of my friends that are at higher up in the Atlanta area, they basically said, the recount is what we're doing, but there's no way to audit anything. As soon in Georgia,
Right.
as soon as they take your signature just by hand, they separate it. So even if you could argue that some of these ballots were illegally cast or whatnot, there's no way to find them.
You couldn't prove it. Yeah. And that, since I've come to a break, I'm going to just put you on hold because what we had is a tweet from the president saying, you might as well just stop recounting in Georgia because if you can't even match signatures, then in some respects, to use the old trite phrase, the horse is out of the barn, the fraud has already taken place, if indeed it's taken place. Let's take a break, though. Let me just mention again, the first article is Here is the Evidence, because that's where you find some of these stories. And if you'd like to read them, it's on our website, pointofview.net.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes. Let me just mention that I'll take another phone call in a minute, but our second article is one that you certainly wouldn't want to read. It was one that I'd already posted for the website today, and then Kelly Shackelford sent me an email, kind of, have you seen it? Oh, yeah, I've already posted it. Because, as I mentioned a minute ago, Jonathan Turley, who is law professor at George Washington University, Democrat, calls himself a liberal, probably is, probably would disagree with a lot of things we talk about here on the program, but pointed out that already you're starting to see a number of what you might call anti-free speech zealots being put on the transition team After all, Joe Biden's convinced he's going to be the next president, and you look at the people he's putting on the team, it should cause you some concern. In his column, again, he's not a Trump supporter at all, but in his column, Jonathan Turley talks about Richard Stengel, who is actually now going to be, according to Joe Biden, the head of the U.S. Agency for Global Media. That'd be Voice of America, Middle East Broadcasting Networks, Radio Free Europe, and radio and all the rest. And as he said, as I mentioned in a previous column, Stengel has been one of the most controversial figures calling for censorship and speech controls. He said last year, Stengel wrote a chilling op-ed in the Washington Post denouncing free speech as a threat to social and political harmony. He made the argument, this is Stengel quoting, all speech is not equal, and where truth cannot drive out lies, we must add new guardrails. In other words, we can't allow people to have free speech, and this is really ominous. So if nothing else, that is the second article we've posted on the website. And one other one before I take another phone call. This one comes from Daniel Galertner, in which he points out that social media censorship has really picked up. In particular, he actually wrote something about World War II, the Holocaust, and gun control. And he said, immediately it was slapped with various kinds of various warnings and called not true. And he said, one problem with the article is the touchingly naive idea that a complex question over which historians continue to argue could be stamped true or false as though there was a fact that's simply been too lazy to look up. He said the second problem is that this fact-checking article is full of factual errors, but that's not surprising when such articles are generally written by a 20-something journalism school graduate who became a so-called expert on World War II that afternoon after her supervisor told her to research a meme on the internet. And he said the biggest problem, however, was that Facebook had decided that this question, remote and unimportant as it might be in our daily lives, was not something you should be allowed to think about. If you thought about it unguided, as though you were, say, an adult and not a school child, you might come to the wrong conclusion. Unless you be misled into thinking there was a connection between gun control and tyranny, Facebook had looked into the matter, and don't worry, they found out there wasn't any connection, so now rest easy and you can move on to fluffy kitten pictures. Anyway, this is one of the other articles I've posted for you, because as you well know, there was a very significant confrontation between those on the Senate Judiciary Committee that are more conservative, and that would be, individuals, for example, like Ted Cruz and a number of others that were part of that. Certainly you could say Mike Lee fits into that category, Josh Hawley, and the heads of Twitter, Jack Dorsey, and the head of Facebook, Mark Zuckerberg. But it's interesting that even the reporting of this from a man by the name of John Hinderrecker points out that actually he's had the biggest problem now with Facebook after the election. The argument always has been, well, they were sort of tamping down some of the information about voter fraud and about Hunter Biden, which now finally Jack Dorsey apologized for. Easier to ask forgiveness than to ask permission. We know all about that one. But here, John Hinderrecker said, I'd had no problem at all. Facebook was happy to take all my money for different ads. But since November 3rd, Facebook has deemed that these ads are are too political. They're really about wasteful state government, because he works in the area of Minneapolis and Minnesota. And so I'm starting to see that it isn't just that they really tamped down censorship before the election. Now that they're convinced that their guy, and that's Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, but in particular Joe Biden, because he's the most malleable of any politician right now, is on their team, they can now censor in ways they never would have dared before. So, as I said in my commentary yesterday on Twitter censorship, I think we have to just face the reality that even though there was a lot of talk yesterday in the Senate Judiciary Committee about whether or not Section 230 should be modified and whether or not they're a publisher or a platform, there's a lot of talk, but not enough will to change that. And so we're just going to have to consider alternatives, whether that's MeWe, Parler, or just staying off social media. Let's take some more phone calls, though, give you a chance to join the conversation. And we will go to Patricia in Texas. Patricia, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Hello. Yes. I was calling basically because I keep hearing all about this voter fraud, this voter fraud, that. Okay. When we elect presidents, we come out there to elect who we think is going to be the best. So when we elected Trump, we thought he would be a good person because he has a good business sense. But instead of him ended up being a good president, he ended up being a president that was he's not very diplomatic at anything. And so the people came out in droves to say, hey, you know what, we're going to replace you because you didn't do the job right. So even if there was some voter fraud in there, say 10,000, 100,000 out of the millions that came out there, when you split all those supposedly voter fraud ballots out throughout all the 50 states and the territories, it doesn't amount to enough to overturn it to bring President Trump to be a president for us again. And it is the people who have spoken. We came out and we stayed in those lines for hours. We sent in our ballots. And, you know, that's what we did. We came out in droves to make sure that he got elected.
Okay. The only part of that I might want to at least challenge, well, actually a couple of them, is that what we're talking about is not voter fraud for the entire election or the popular vote. Because, again, it's Electoral College 101. You're not elected by the popular vote. You're elected by the electoral vote. And if you think of some of the questions in what are essentially the 6 states where there are lawsuits right now. Again, if you're unfamiliar, there's lawsuits in Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Georgia. On the West Coast, Arizona, and Nevada. Now, just to actually mess with everybody for a minute, imagine that all of those lawsuits come to a point where there's enough question in each one of those to not certify that election, then that means those electors would not go to their particular states to vote. And then what you would have is Donald Trump would have 232 electoral votes, Joe Biden would have 227 electoral votes, and nobody would have the requisite 270. That's not going to happen, and I understand that. But the key issue here is simply the issue of the fact that it wasn't necessarily that you have thousands or even tens of thousands of questionable votes that would affect the popular vote. But if some of those thousands of votes are in some of those key states that both Donald Trump and Joe Biden need, that's the real question that is still on the table. But we'll cover that tomorrow since we're simply out of time today. And if nothing else, I want to thank Doug for his work as an engineer today and Steve for his help as well. Hope you join us tomorrow. Richard Land, O.S. Hawkins, Lisa Turkus. We've got all sorts of things to talk about, and we will see you back here, right here, on Point of View.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/sign-up. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints commentary at pointofview.net/signup. pointofview.net/signup. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.